Welcome to day 24, One Body in Christ. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we, who are many, are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us: prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. In this letter to the Romans, St. Paul sets out his great narrative of how fallen humanity is saved in Christ in chapters 1 to 8, and then addresses the specific question of how the people of Israel, God's first covenant people, are themselves included in God's redeeming work in Christ in chapters 9 to 11. Now, in the third and final section of this, the longest of his epistles, St. Paul turns to the question of Christian living. He begins in chapter 12, verse 1, by reaching for the language of Kant, inviting the Christians in Rome to offer spiritual worship. In Greek, latria is a word that has a definite connotation of liturgical worship. So he invites the Christians in Rome to offer spiritual worship by means of the living sacrifice of themselves, holy and acceptable to God. Through his use of the terminology of priesthood, worship and sacrifice, Paul teaches his readers to understand themselves to be a priestly people. Christian life and worship go together, and both have a sacrificial character because both depend on the sacrifice of Christ himself. In his first letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul writes, within a very short space, about the Eucharist and about the character of the Christian community, using the metaphor of the body in 1 Corinthians 11 to 12. Here, in Romans, composed after 1 Corinthians, Paul returns to the image of the body and sets it in the context of a longer passage which reflects on the qualities and characteristics that should be the hallmarks of Christian living. While in the Romans text, Paul does not write explicitly about the Eucharist, the parallels with his train of thought in 1 Corinthians and his use of the language of liturgical worship already noted can lead us reasonably to conclude that the Eucharist was not far from his mind when he composed Romans 12. This holding together of Christian worship with Christian living is very important. It's a corrective to two possible errors that can creep into our understanding of what it means to be a Christian. The first mistake is to suggest that being a Christian can be defined by leading a good life, serving others, making the right choices and observing the moral law. The problem here is the omission of the dimension of worship, of the calling to participate in the liturgy of the new covenant, or what we call the Eucharist, that perfect offering of spiritual sacrifices to God. The reverse mistake is to fail to realize that right worship must flow into right living. The offering of worship, and particularly the celebration of the Eucharist, can never be isolated from every aspect of the life of the body, and every member of the body has his or her part to play. A good test of any Christian community may be to assess its life and character in the light of what Paul writes in Romans 12. Is the liturgy at the centre of its life, celebrated with care, beauty and dignity? Is there a diversity of members of the body in this particular local manifestation of the Church, each bringing his or her own gifts and calling for the better flourishing of the whole? Does the life of this Eucharistic community bear fruit in Christ-likeness, in personal growth and holiness, in sacrificial living? Does it play a part in the life of the wider church responsibly and generously? And does it extend a welcome to all in Christ's name? See Romans chapters 12 and 13. Action. Spend some time, perhaps by yourself or in company with fellow worshippers, considering your own local church or worshipping community in the light of these thoughts. And our prayer, a prayer of Bishop Thomas Ken, who lived between 1637 and 1711 after Holy Communion. So our prayer. Glory to thee, O Jesus, my Lord and my God, for thus feeding my soul with thy most blessed body and blood. O let thy heavenly food transfuse new life